Day.
Thanks for that completely spontaneous round of applause. Thanks so much for letting me come and be with you and speak to you on this hugely significant topic. Let me just start with a story and then a question. During the Second World War, in the Nazi concentration camp at Ravensbrück, there was an inmate called Maria, and one day she saw the kind of line of inmates who were being marched to the showers, the gas chambers, to be killed. And amongst them was a little girl who was absolutely terrified. And Maria walked across to this little girl, took her hand and walked with her, speaking softly to her, comforting her, all the way into the gas chambers, and she died alongside her. So here's the question: was there any meaning in that suffering? Was there any meaning in Maria's pain or not? And I'd love to hear what you think about that question, and I'd love to hear what you think about this question more generally: is there any meaning in our pain? Because I think this is such an important question for us, because it's something that every single one of us will face at one point or another. Maybe some of us are facing it now, or maybe it will be in the future. Some of us, it will be kind of ourselves. Others, maybe someone that we really care about. It could be physical illness, or it could be struggles with mental health. It could be relational breakdown. It could be losing someone that we love. Whatever it is. But, for me at the moment, the biggest source of pain for me at the moment is my wife's struggle that she's having with mental health. So if there's anyone here who is in a similar situation and will want to talk that through, I'd love to chat to you afterwards. But whatever it is, when it hits us, the question is, how will we deal with it? How will we make sense of that pain? And from the start, I just want to come right out and say that pain is pain, no matter what you believe. It's still horrible. And I'm absolutely not about to try and say that Christianity is some kind of magic, 100% cure for whatever it is that you're going through. Absolutely not. But at the same time, I think it is really important that what we believe about ourselves and the world, about the future and about God, really does make a profound difference to how we think and how we feel about the things that we go through. And I'm convinced, both kind of rationally and from my own experience and the experience of many, many other people, that believing in the God who's revealed in Jesus, that trusting that God really does make a profound difference in the midst of real agony and pain. So I want to start off by just looking at the kind of a different perspective on this question of suffering and pain to my own. Probably the more common kind of point of view in the room today, a kind of non-religious point of view. This question, is there any meaning in our pain, is not something that you find non-religious thinkers speaking about a lot, but recently I came across a really interesting set of videos from Humanist UK, kind of explaining what they believe, these little animated videos narrated by the legend that is Stephen Fry. And I'm sure not many of us necessarily would define ourselves as humanists, but I think what they're articulating is really the normal kind of non-religious view in the UK today. And in this video on what should we think about death, it says this: death is a natural part of life. It makes sense for us to try not to be afraid of it, but instead to come to terms with it. Then we can focus instead on finding meaning in the here and now. Meaning and purpose in the here and now, making the most of the one life we know we have. So what do you think? Does that sound like kind of similar to how you would respond to this question of meaning and pain? It's very kind of reasonable and measured, isn't it? It's saying, well, there's nothing beyond death or anything like that. But there's no reason to fear that nothingness. There's no reason to be scared of it. We just need to try not to think about it too much and focus instead on the here and now. It actually reminds me a lot of the slogan that Humanist UK put on buses across the UK back in 2009 that just said this: there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So try not to worry about God or life after death or any of these big questions. Just focus on what makes you happy now. That's basically the advice. Don't worry about suffering and death. Just try your best to live a happy life. So in the next few minutes, what I want to do is just suggest two big things that I think are aspects of our experience of suffering and whether there's meaning in it, whatever we believe, and just compare how this non-religious view kind of connects with that in general, not just this specific quote, and then compare that with how Jesus connects with those things. And the first thing I want to suggest, I think, is not very controversial. It's that hope makes suffering meaningful for us. I think the most vivid example of this would be actually childbirth, right? I have never given birth to a child and hopefully will not have to. But it seems from the films and stuff and people who tell me that they have, like it's really pretty painful. There's some serious pain involved, right? It's agony. And all the while, you're in this intense pain, and people are all around you kind of shouting at you, keep going, come on, you can do it, keep pushing, don't give up, go on, right? Can I ask you to imagine for a moment, imagine a midwife saying to this woman who's in labor, keep going, keep pushing. The baby is never going to come out. You're just going to be in this agony for the rest of your life. Keep going. Would she keep going? I mean, if she actually believed her, surely she wouldn't. She would just give up because it would be utterly hopeless. But in real life, obviously, mothers amazingly can push through that, can keep going. Why? Because they know that even though it's agony now, life is coming. Joy is coming. And when that life comes, it's going to be worth it. And that's what we mean when we talk about hope. I'm definitely not talking about that just sort of vague sense of, well, hopefully it'll turn out all right. We're talking about something that is real and solid, but future tense. And we all know that in kind of small-scale personal experience, hope can make various kinds of suffering meaningful for us. Whether it's training hard, even when it hurts, so that we can get brilliant in our sport, or whether it's working hard in a really boring job because we're saving up to travel. Hope makes suffering meaningful for us. But if we kind of zoom out to the bigger picture and think about it from a non-religious point of view, is there any hope? Is there anything we can look ahead to and say, keep going, it's worth it? And of course, if there's no God and no life after death of any sort, then for most of the suffering in our lives, and certainly most of the suffering across the world, then there really is nothing that we can kind of look ahead to that puts the suffering now in perspective. Nothing that we can look ahead to and say, life is coming. Death just draws a line under the injustices of life. So what about if Christianity is true, if there really is a God who's revealed in Jesus? Well, I could talk about this for hours, and we looked in depth at it yesterday, but the evidence is that Jesus actually came back from the dead, that he rose from the dead, and he spoke to and ate with and touched his disciples. And he said that this wasn't just some kind of one-off, it wasn't a magic trick. He said it was actually like a kind of second Big Bang. He'd gone into death, smashed through it, come out the other side, and now it's this explosion into our world of a whole new world, a healed world. A world where life has triumphed over death, and love has triumphed over hate and evil. A world that is everything this world was always meant to be. And in fact, Jesus himself actually used the image of childbirth. He said that the suffering in this world now, that it was like labor pains. That it's horrible and it's real, but that if it's really true, if he's come back from the dead, we can keep going because we know that life is coming. Joy is coming. So that's my first suggestion. Hope makes suffering meaningful. For the next one, I want to come back to that story that we started with of Maria in Ravensbrück and ask, was that suffering meaningful? Was it meaningful for her to take that girl's hand, walk into the gas chambers and die alongside her? Was that pain meaningful? And I think surely it is, right? Surely we think, if that's not meaningful, then nothing is at all, right? So then why? What makes that meaningful? And put simply, I want to suggest that it's this. Love makes suffering meaningful. And I reckon most of us feel instinctively that love is so valuable that it can give meaning even to suffering. So if somebody is grieving, having lost somebody that they love, we don't say to them, well, get over it, try and be happy. Because we know that grief, that pain is a meaningful part of their love for that person. That the pain is worth suffering in a sense because the love is so valuable. Or in other situations, we would encourage someone to keep going and endure suffering for the sake of someone they love. We'd say, that wasn't stupid, that's beautiful, that's right. Or if we knew somebody who was really, really struggling and was thinking about giving up completely, we would want to be able to say to them, we wouldn't want to blame them, we want to be able to say to them, look, you don't have to give up because we love you, your friends, your family, we love you. We feel instinctively that love is so valuable that it gives meaning even to suffering. And why is that? I think that our instinct is that love, real kind of serious, gritty, not just fluffy, romantic love, that is the most important thing, that it's even more important than kind of pain or pleasure. Which is, I think, a bit of a difficulty with a non-Christian, non-religious view of the world. Because if there is no God, if all there is just physical matter, then firstly the universe is fundamentally impersonal. We're the kind of odd ones out in that sense. And secondly, life, if we're just animals who happen to have evolved complex patterns of thought and socialization as an aid to survival, life is fundamentally competitive. And love might be a helpful strategy, it might be a useful habit to have got into, but there's no fundamental value there. The fundamental value, if this is the case, would be survival and reproducing, which I guess you could translate to the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of pleasure, and at a stretch, the avoidance of sadness, the pursuit of happiness, which is basically the advice that you get in that humanist video. But if you think about Maria and that little child for a minute. If avoiding pain and getting happiness is the most important thing, the fundamental value, then what she did was utterly meaningless, wasn't it? In fact, you could even say that it was wrong, because she actually decreased the total amount of happiness and increased the amount of pain. I mean, she slightly improved just a couple of minutes of that little girl's life, and she traded for that all of her own potential future happiness and replaced it with intense suffering and death. So if pain and pleasure are really the most valuable things, then logically what she should have done is just try to not worry about it and try to enjoy her life. So what do you think? Do you think love is valuable enough that it's even more valuable than happiness? Because if the God revealed to us in Jesus is real, then there's actually a very, very good reason for us to think that love is the most important thing. Because Jesus said that the universe is fundamentally personal. And in fact, that life is not fundamentally competitive, but is the overflow of love. He said that the Father and him had loved each other since before the foundation of the world. And that God is not a lonely dictator, but he's actually a family of love. That's why the Bible says that God is love, and it actually literally means it. And human beings were created by love, for love. And Jesus says that a truly human life can be summed up in two things. Love God with all of your being, and love everyone around you as much as you love and care about yourself. So, in a world that's made by and for that kind of everlasting love, it makes complete sense that we would feel as if love is the most valuable thing. And it really can give meaning even to suffering. But to explore how that love and our actual experience of suffering really relate, I want to introduce just a third suggestion alongside it, which is this. I think that suffering alone is the worst kind of pain. Suffering on our own is deep down a different kind of pain to suffering alongside other people. This is why it actually helps in our kind of darkest times for someone to just be with us. Maybe they're not even saying anything. Maybe they're crying with us, or maybe they are just there. That helps, doesn't it? Sometimes it's the only thing that does help. And it's why as well, in films, when the tidal wave's about to hit, everyone's about to die, and the characters kind of reach out and take hold of each other, we don't sit there thinking, well, what's the point of that? We know what the point is. And maybe more importantly, when it comes to Maria, that story, that's why that's so poignant and beautiful. It's because that little girl didn't have to suffer on her own. Suffering alone is the worst kind of suffering. Maybe because suffering without love feels meaningless. So how does Jesus interact with all of that? Well, in one of the predictions about Jesus' birth, Jesus is described as God with us. Jesus is God coming to be with us and to love us in the midst of all our suffering and pain. And of course, as I say that, it sounds like a nice idea, but the immediate question is, well, how on earth can we know that? How on earth can we be sure of that? Even if we've said to Jesus, I trust you, I want you to be with me, I want you to love me. How on earth can we be sure in the midst of all of this pain that we go through in life, that he really does love us, that he really is there with us? And I just want to show you the one thing that has really convinced me of that. And to show it to you, I want to have a look at something actually in the biographies of Jesus that has shocked and confused Christians through the centuries. On your chairs, there are these little books. Do pick them up now. They're a biography of Jesus, written by Mark. And if you turn, we're just going to look at a bit on, starts on page 84, just at the bottom. So if you open it up, page 84 is kind of near the middle of the book. And we're looking at the climax, really, of Mark's account of Jesus' life. And we'll start right near the bottom of that page at the sentence number 25, and just read for a little bit about what happened when Jesus died. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, here comes the shock. This is the shock. Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So this is Jesus, who said, he called God Father in a way that no one else dared to do. He said that him and the Father had loved each other since before the foundation of the world. And here he is, hanging naked and beaten and bleeding, dying in agony. And he's crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" No, his enemies are hurling abuse and insults at him. One of his friends has betrayed him. Others have abandoned him. And now, in the depths of his agony, even his Father has forsaken him. And this is our worst nightmare, isn't it? Utter agony, humiliation, a slow and cruel death, and all of it utterly alone. No one with him, no love. So why is Jesus going through that? That's the question that everyone who's read this, I think, in history has found themselves asking. Why is he going through that? And it's not because he can't help it. The irony of the taunts that he's getting is thick. People are saying to him, you saved others, but he can't save himself. But of course, he could have saved himself. In fact, he'd gone to Jerusalem intentionally, knowing that this was what was going to happen. He'd allowed himself intentionally to be arrested. He'd refused to defend himself at his trial. He could have got out of this in so many ways, but he didn't. He didn't save himself. And the irony is that it was precisely because he was saving others. He'd actually explained to his followers a few chapters earlier in this biography that he did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So he's saying that he's giving his life for us as a ransom, as the price of our freedom. And so that kind of raises the question, to really understand what's happening here, what is he saving us from? If he's saving us by refusing to save himself, what's that from? And the idea of him being a ransom, giving his life as a ransom, well, you only need to pay a ransom for a hostage or a slave. Jesus is implying that in some way we're trapped. And of course, on one level, that's obvious, isn't it? We are trapped in a world of suffering and death. There's really no way out of that. And so in a sense, what we're seeing here is that Jesus is dying to save us from death. But it actually, I think, goes even deeper than that. Because Jesus said that real life, that being fully human, being fully alive, was, as we were saying earlier, to love everyone around us as much as we love ourselves, and to love God with our whole being. And when you hear that, I don't know about you, but I think, we just think, well, I can't really imagine that. That doesn't sound very realistic. You can't love everyone around you as much as you love yourself. And I don't even know what it would be like to love God with my whole being. I mean, I don't know if I even want that. We can't really imagine it. But here's the thing. This is exactly what Jesus is saying. He's saying you can't imagine it because you're trapped. You're trapped in this, and so it feels completely normal. It feels like that's just what it's like to be a human being. He says we're trapped by this kind of inward drag towards ourselves, towards looking after ourselves, protecting ourselves, getting stuff for ourselves. And Jesus warned people, he said, if you keep putting yourself at the center of the universe, if you keep pushing God away, then in the end you'll find that actually you've put yourself at the center of a dungeon of unlove, utterly alone. But Jesus gave his life as a ransom. Jesus stepped in to that dungeon that we're creating for ourselves of isolation and unlove, and he suffered that isolation for us so that we would never have to. That's why he said he was letting this happen to him. The night he was arrested, he quoted a piece of Old Testament poetry and said that it was referring to him, predicting what he would do. And let's just have a look at a little piece of it. He said, it says, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He was pierced for our rebellion. He was crushed for our cruelties. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, but the Lord has laid on him the evil of us all. Do you see what the poetry is pointing to there? Jesus hasn't gone astray. He has loved his Father perfectly. He's loved other people completely. He doesn't deserve to be left alone at all. And yet, he puts himself there instead of us. He allows himself to be pierced and crushed and forsaken so that we would never need to be. Why have you abandoned me? Because he will not abandon us. And for someone who has trusted Jesus, who has received what Jesus has done for us there, and said, I need you, I want you to be with me, can I say that deeply changes what it's like to experience suffering? Because even when there's so much that we don't understand. Love makes suffering meaningful. And if we know that God has done this for us, that he has died forsaken and alone for our sake because he loves us that much, then we can be sure that whatever it is we're going through, that we say, God, why are you letting this happen to me? It cannot be because he doesn't love us. He does. He loves us that much. And we also know that however badly or bitterly we respond to our suffering, whatever we do, whether we lash out and hurt others or even hurt him, that he will never abandon us. That whatever we do, he will never leave us alone because Jesus was abandoned so that we would never need to be. And can I say finally, that I think that this confidence, this certainty that God loves us like that, loves us to death, and the certainty we were talking about that Jesus has come back from the dead, that life is coming, I think that certainty gives us a real courage and a strength to love and care for other people who are suffering. That was actually what gave Maria the courage and the motivation to go and hold that little girl's hand. It said that as she took her hand, she said to her, "Christ is risen, there is nothing to fear." There's a historian called Rodney Stark who writes a book about the rise of the early Christianity, and he talks about an outbreak of bubonic plague in Rome under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And all of the famous kind of pagan doctors were fleeing the city to safety, but the Christians stayed in the city to nurse and care for the sick and the dying, even at the cost of their own lives. And I don't know about you, maybe you have experienced something of this in your own life. Maybe you've got a mate at uni here who is a Christian who stays, who cares for people and cares for you because they know the love of a God who cares and who would rather die than leave them alone. So the question is, what do you make of that God and what do you want to do about that? Maybe some of you here, there's so many questions, there's so many things that you're like, yeah, but what about this? I don't understand this. How can you say that? I'd love to hear your questions. Please do text them in. There are so many good questions, and we this week is all about engaging in that conversation, thinking those things through. But maybe for some of us, actually, maybe there's loads that you still don't understand, there's a lot you still don't know, but you know enough that you get who this Jesus is, you get why he died like that. And you know that actually you want that to be for you. You want that to be, you want him to be with you. And can I say, if you do want that, you can just ask him. You really can just ask him. Why not kind of take a moment today to just think to yourself, well, yeah, actually, I do want that. And if that's you, I'd love to chat to you. Please grab me. I'd love to know who you are so I can be praying for you. I can try and support you as you start to understand what that step would mean. Or grab anyone else who you know who's a Christian, any of the people around in human jumpers. We'd love to chat to you about that. And if either of those things are you, if you've got loads of questions or if that's you, it would make so much sense to just pick up those feedback forms in a minute on your chairs and just write your contact details on there and tick the box in the middle of the boxes that says that you'd be up for meeting up with a Christian and chatting about these things. We'd love to hear your questions. We'd love to help you think these things through. But for now, take a minute just to turn to the person next to you. We'll have time to text in questions. The number will be up on the screen. I'd love to hear your questions. Chat about what questions this raises for you with the person next to you as you text them in. That would be great. Thanks.
Great. We're going to start answering some of the questions, but if you do have any more, just feel free to text them in. We'll try and get to them. The first question is, why does God forsake Jesus?
Brilliant question. So hopefully I tried to explain that a bit already. And of course, the reason that it's so shocking for Christians through the centuries, the reason it's such a mysterious, kind of deep moment, is that Jesus was very clear that he wasn't just a man kind of like everybody else, and that it was God being kind of, that God is up there and he was being particularly harsh to this one man in a way that somehow was of benefit to all of the other people in the world. Jesus was very clear that he was God's son, in the sense that he was the eternal Son of God, that within God there was the Father, there's him, there's the Holy Spirit. They've always loved each other from before the foundation of the world. And so what you're seeing in that moment is an utterly kind of cosmos-shattering moment where the eternal love of the Father and the Son is kind of broken and alienated in that moment. And the reason he's doing it is that the way that we kind of turn in on ourselves, the way that we fail to love others like we love ourselves, the way that we refuse to love God as much as he loves us, we kind of cave in on ourselves, and the rightful consequences of that is, as I was saying, that we end up kind of locked into this eternal isolation of unlove and loneliness, and I can't imagine anything worse than that. But God doesn't want to leave us in that, even though that's kind of what we deserve. He loves us so much that what he says is, I'm going to come in the person of my Son, and I'm going to kind of step into your place for you. I'm going to step into that dungeon of darkness and aloneness and forsakenness that is what you rightfully should find yourself in. I'm going to step into it for you, so that that's done, it's dealt with, and instead, because you're united to me, you can have my life, my love, my connection forever with the Father. And so the reason that God the Father forsakes Jesus the Son in that moment is so that he never has to forsake us if we'll unite ourselves to Jesus. So thank you for that question. If I haven't answered it properly, I'd love to chat to you more afterwards.
Another question that's come in is, all very well, but what do we do with suffering that isn't the consequence of human action? Why do these people suffer?
Yeah, fantastic question. So, I mean, this is a classic, huge question. I'd love to have more time to answer it. I might take a little bit longer than normal to try and answer it, because I want to do it justice. Because basically it's this classic question of, if there is a God who's all-loving and all-powerful, then how come there is so much suffering in the world? And if you try and just blame it on what human beings do to each other, it still doesn't work, because there's all these natural disasters, there's illness, there's disease, there's all kinds of horrible things that we don't do to each other that just happen. And I think there are a couple of kind of aspects to that question. One, I think often the way we think about it makes them. So I'll start kind of logically, as a logical argument against God's existence. The problem with it logically is that what it involves is kind of abstracting from what the Bible and Jesus tell us about God, abstracting a couple of kind of theoretical statements about him being all-powerful and being all-loving, and then sort of applying our own definition of what we mean by loving, and then reapplying that to the world and saying, well, it doesn't fit. But actually, if you look at what you see in the Bible, and I think hopefully it helps what we were exploring just now, love is something much deeper than trying to give people pleasure and avoid giving them pain. We all know this in everyday life. You know that, like, every parent knows this. Love is often much more complicated than just, I want you to be happy. Love is deeper than that and more complex than that. And so just logically, it's not actually rational for us to say, well, abstractly, the Bible says that God is all loving, and that means that if he could stop any kind of suffering or pain, he would. The picture of God that you see in the Bible actually fits perfectly with the aching in this world. And I'll come back to that in a second. The second thing I'd want to say is, when we look at the suffering in the world, particularly things that are natural, our hearts do cry out and say, that is not right. It shouldn't be like that. This isn't okay. Earthquakes that kill people, cancers that destroy people's bodies gradually in agony. It's not okay. And I just want to absolutely say that is so right. And Jesus says that's absolutely right. Christianity says that's absolutely right. This is not how things should be. But what I would want to say is, actually, if we don't believe in God, if we don't believe in Christianity, having that problem with suffering in the natural world doesn't actually make any sense anymore. Because if there is no God, there's a famous quote on this. I wanted to include it in the talk, but I didn't have time, from C.S. Lewis, who was exploring the question of God. He basically said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of unjust and just? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And in the end, he says, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we would never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. And so the question I'd want to ask is, if there is no God, if there is no source of goodness and what is right and what should be that's outside of the natural world, then when we look at the natural world and the suffering in it, actually, how can we say that it's wrong? How can we say that it shouldn't be like that? Even something as horrendous as sexual abuse or rape, right? If we are just animals and the fundamental drive is to survive and reproduce, it's utterly natural. But we know that it's absolutely wrong. And this is why I'm actually so glad that Christianity has a problem with evil and suffering. Because I want to have a problem with evil and suffering. And I don't want to have a worldview that actually tells me that when I say this isn't right, this isn't how it should be, that I'm being irrational, that I'm being stupid, that I'm just sort of expressing a preference, and actually this is just natural, this is how it should be. And when you see Jesus interacting with suffering, you see there's a moment where his friend Lazarus has died. He sees Mary, who's Lazarus' sister, weeping, and Jesus just bursts into tears. He just breaks down. And this is the creator of the universe, and he looks at suffering and death and he says, this isn't right. This is not how it should be. And that is what the Bible says, is that suffering and death is a kind of crack in the whole universe. It's not how it should be, that fundamentally something has gone profoundly wrong, and that in a deep sense, because humans are connected, we have this kind of unique role as leaders of the whole of this earth, that in our kind of twisting and turning away from God, that we've actually, in some deep way, cracked and twisted the whole universe, and that things are not as they should be because of that, but that God is going to put them right. And there's a whole load of questions around precisely why it works like that. But I think that fundamental thing is we need an understanding of the world that says it shouldn't be like this. And Christianity gives you that, and it makes sense of that in a way that I'm convinced nothing else does. So either you're a Christian, you have a problem with suffering, or if you're going to be rational about it, you can reject God, but you also have to not have a problem with suffering, which I don't think any of us want to do.